Did Julius Caesar exist? Did Cicero exist? Did Socrates or Aristotle or Mark Antony? Almost no one questions whether these people existed. So why is there so much controversy around the question, did Jesus exist?
Are there any other documents besides the Bible that talk about Jesus?
Yeah, actually there are. Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in Roman, Jewish, and extra-biblical Christian sources. Some of these have been cataloged in a book by R.T. France, spelled like the country France, called The Evidence for Jesus, or a more recent book, The Jesus Legend by Paul Eddy. And Greg Boyd has a nice chapter in which they discuss the extra-biblical testimony to Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus, for example, the Jewish historian, has a very interesting passage on Jesus and even talks about his brother James. He talks about John the Baptist. Many of the same people that appear in the biblical Gospels are there in the pages of Josephus. So it's quite amazing. We actually have more historical information about this relatively obscure man, this Galilean preacher named Jesus of Nazareth, than we do about many major figures of antiquity. So if you're interested, take a look at those books.
Yeah. The reason I bring it up is simply in the course of preparing for this debate, I encountered the claims that there is no record of Jesus apart from
Who said
the
that?
Gospel. I didn't even look at it. It struck me as quite a wild claim.
I will say there are certain kooks out there writing today, especially on the internet, people like G.A. Wells and others who make these radical claims like Jesus of Nazareth never existed and so forth. And they're completely rejected within the guild of professional historians and biblical scholars. And the book by Eddy and Boyd that I mentioned deals extensively with some of these fellows. But as I mentioned, the passage in Josephus, in Tacitus, the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion, there are references in Jewish Talmud. They're discussed in the sources that I gave you.
Thanks. I was rather struck by the claim, and it seemed quite wild to me.
Zeitgeist, from the German Spirit of the Age, is an immensely popular movie that can be viewed all over the internet. It has millions of hits and has extreme popular appeal, especially to those who are into a good conspiracy theory. Now, the second half of the film is an elaborate portrayal of the 9/11 tragedy as the work of the American government itself. But the first half calls into question the entire story of Christianity. Centuries of Christian history are swept away as the narrator explains that the whole thing is one large myth. Large historical claims are made that, if true, do mean it's all over for those wanting to place any hope in Jesus as someone relevant to today. To get some wisdom on this complicated topic, we've asked into the studio Dr. Chris Forbes, a senior lecturer in the Ancient History Department at Macquarie University in Sydney. Dr. Forbes is a specialist in the history of Greek thought and religion, Alexander the Great, and New Testament history. Chris, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've seen the Zeitgeist. What led you, an ancient historian, to watch this internet movie, and what was your initial reaction?
Well, I first heard of it because my daughter was spending 5 months studying in Russia. She was at St. Petersburg, and Christian friends of hers there who were getting a really hard time by people making claims from the movie, and she emailed me and said, "What can you find out about it?" So I had a look.
And your response?
Well, I ended up almost laughing because the claims it makes are mostly wildly wrong and in some cases simply silly.
Can we focus in on what is really the heart of the claim of the movie as it connects with Jesus? And that is that the whole Jesus story of him being born right through to his crucifixion and resurrection is a mishmash of ancient mythologies. In particular, the mythology of the sun god of Egypt, Horus, we're told.
John, can I stop you there? Horus isn't a sun god.
Okay, but the movie says that he is.
Yes, it does, but he's not.
What sort of god was he?
He's the god of the sky. Ra is the sun god.
Okay. That makes the connection between him being a sun god and Jesus being the son of God more difficult, doesn't it?
I thought it was only a pun to start with. I mean, the Son of God, S-U-N-S-O-N, it's a perfectly good pun in English. Well, it's a fairly bad pun in English. But it doesn't work in Egyptian, and it doesn't work in Greek, and it doesn't work in Latin. It's just a pun.
So leaving all that aside,
yeah.
The claims about this particular sky god then, Horus, are that he was born on December 25th. He was adored by 3 kings. He grew up, he had 12 disciples. He was crucified and then he was resurrected. Well, that sounds like the Jesus story.
It does, because that's what it is. But it's not the Horus story. Oh, by the way, you left out born of a virgin.
Born of a virgin, indeed.
Yes, except that his mother Isis wasn't a virgin. And there's no suggestion in the Egyptian sources that she was. This whole list of parallels are true of Jesus, aren't actually true of Horus at all.
The ancient sources don't mention these details?
It's pretty unlikely that the ancient Egyptians would say that Horus was born on December the 25th, because December is a Latin month and their calendar is completely different. Was Horus crucified and raised from the dead? No, Horus wasn't crucified. Horus wasn't killed at all. Osiris was killed, betrayed and killed by his brother Set, who then cut up his body into very small pieces and had them scattered all over Egypt so they couldn't be patched back together and resuscitated. And the rest of the myth of Osiris is about Isis gathering the pieces of his body, binding them up with bandages so that he can become the first mummy and therefore be resuscitated. But all of that happens not in historical time. That all happens in the Egyptian equivalent of the dream time, in mythological time.
I guess the punchline of the Zeitgeist movie, as it connects with Jesus, is that because the Jesus story is just a mythical construct, which you're saying it isn't, the movie is saying he didn't exist. He's not a historical figure. Does that have currency in serious historical research today?
No, there's no serious question for historians that Jesus actually lived. There's real issues about whether he is really the way the Bible described him. There's real issues about particular incidents in his life. But no serious ancient historian doubts that Jesus was a real person, really living in Galilee in the 1st century.
The movie, in its list of references, if you get the transcript, some characters pop up, some scholars pop up, and it gives this sense that it is an authoritative movie, like Gerald Macy, G.A. Wells.
Gerald Macy, English poet and amateur Egyptologist. Not an expert, not an academic, not actually an historian at all. G.A. Wells, an academic, yes. Professor of German literature. Writer of popular books, trying to claim that Jesus is a myth. But he's not a historian.
Did you find any serious historical work in the list of references?
Not a single one. What I found is a whole list of books claiming to be written by experts, quoting other people claiming to be experts, quoting actually none of the ancient evidence at all.
And yet a lot of people have been enamoured with this movie or deeply troubled by it. What is your advice to them?
Can I be awfully blunt? Don't believe everything you see on YouTube.
Given that this interview will also be on YouTube, have you got any further advice for them?
Yes. Check references. Go looking for ancient evidence. If somebody claims something about Horus or Mithras or Dionysus, if they're only quoting another modern author, or in the case of Massey, someone writing in the 19th century, that's not good enough. What historians want to know is not do you quote historians, they want to know can you quote ancient evidence. And there's simply no ancient evidence that Horus or Mithras or Dionysus was born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, crucified. The ancient stories simply don't say that about them. So the parallels with Jesus just collapse.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I can assure you, as a historian, that whatever else you might want to say about Jesus, he certainly existed. The historical Jesus may not have been the person that people imagine today, but he was a real person, and we can know some things about him. You don't have to believe that Jesus was the Son of God in order to accept the facts of history. And that's what I deal with in my book, the facts. Skeptics like to say that we don't have the original text of any of the Gospels of the New Testament, and we don't have any historical records of Jesus from his day. That's absolutely right, but it's also true of virtually everyone who lived at his time, including such powerful and important figures as Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and Josephus, the Jewish historian. Some of those who claim that Jesus was a myth argue that he was invented along the lines of the gods of pagan mythology, who also died and were resurrected. In my book, I show why that also cannot be correct. The evidence for the historical Jesus, as for Pilate and Josephus, is overwhelming when looked at through the impartial lens. Did Jesus exist is a historical detective story. I invite you to look at the hard, cold facts of the case and judge for yourself.
I do not see evidence in archaeology or history for a historical Jesus.
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. Well, I mean, okay, yeah. I mean, I have a whole book on it. I mean, so there is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence that it is not. I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who. I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that is not evidence. That is not evidence. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. But if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar in every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you've got a different opinion, you better have a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically, rather than coming up with the theory that Jesus didn't exist.